The morning sun cast long shadows across the half-finished commercial building on the outskirts of Detroit. For Maria Santos, a 34-year-old construction worker from Honduras, this Tuesday started like any other, arriving at 6 a.m. sharp, her tool belt heavy against her hips, her orange safety vest bright against the gray concrete landscape. Maria had been in the United States for 7 years now. She'd crossed the border with nothing but hope and a faded photograph of her 2 daughters, Isabella and Sofia, who remained with her mother back in Tegucigalpa. Every week, she sent money home, money earned through 12-hour shifts, aching muscles, and the kind of physical labor that left her hands permanently calloused and her back perpetually sore. This particular construction site was supposed to be her breakthrough. After years of being paid under the table, working without benefits, and living in constant fear of deportation, Maria had finally landed a legitimate position with Morrison & Associates Construction. She had a real contract, workers' compensation, and even health insurance. For the first time in years, she felt like a real person, not just a shadow moving through America's workforce. The site manager, James Morrison, was a third-generation construction executive who'd inherited the family business. At 42, he wore expensive suits to construction sites, a peculiar habit that set him apart from other managers. Today, his navy blue 3-piece suit was immaculate despite the dust and debris surrounding them. He prided himself on being a hands-on manager, though his hands had never actually mixed concrete or laid brick. That morning, James had arrived in a foul mood. His wife had served him divorce papers the night before, his teenage son had been expelled from private school for the 3rd time, and the bank had sent another threatening letter about the company's mounting debts. Morrison & Associates Construction was bleeding money, largely due to James's poor financial decisions and his gambling problem, a secret he'd kept hidden from everyone except his accountant and his loan shark. Maria was on her knees, carefully setting cement bags in preparation for the day's pour, when James approached. She'd learned to read the moods of men in power. It was a survival skill she'd developed over years of navigating workplace dynamics as an immigrant woman in a male-dominated industry. Today, something in James's stride made her nervous. "Santos," he called out, his voice sharp. "What the hell is this?" Maria looked up, squinting against the sun now positioned directly behind James's head, creating an almost halo effect that felt cruelly ironic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. I don't understand." James pointed at the cement bags she'd been organizing. "These are the wrong materials. I specifically ordered Type 2 cement for this section, and you've brought out Type 1. Do you have any idea how much this mistake could cost us?" Maria's heart sank. She pulled out her work order, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. "But Mr. Morrison, the order sheet says Type 1 for this section. See, it's right here." She held up the document, pointing to the specifications she'd followed exactly. James snatched the paper from her hands, barely glancing at it before crumpling it into a ball. "Don't tell me what the order says. I wrote these specifications myself. Are you calling me a liar?" Behind them, other workers had stopped to watch. Among them was David Chen, a 28-year-old college graduate who'd taken a construction job after his architecture degree proved worthless in a saturated market. He'd watched James interact with Maria before and had always found the dynamic unsettling. There was something in the way James spoke to her, a particular condescension he never used with the male workers. "Actually, Mr. Morrison," David interjected, stepping forward, "I helped Maria load those bags this morning." The order sheet definitely specified Type 1 for this section. "I double-checked it myself." James's face flushed red. For a moment, it seemed he might explode at both of them. But then his phone rang, the special ringtone he'd assigned to his loan shark. His expression changed from anger to something closer to fear. He answered, turning away and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Maria used this moment to stand up, her knees protesting after being bent on the hard concrete. At 5 feet 2, she barely reached James's shoulder, but she'd learned long ago that physical stature meant nothing compared to the power dynamics of citizenship, gender, and economic desperation. When James finished his call, his mood had somehow darkened further. He'd just been informed that his payment was 3 weeks overdue, and if he didn't deliver $50,000 by Friday, there would be consequences for him and his family. The walls were closing in on James Morrison, and like many men who find themselves trapped, he looked for someone weaker to blame. "Santos, you're fired," he said flatly, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "Clear out your locker and get off my site." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. "What? Mr. Morrison, please," I followed the order exactly. "I have 3 more months until my work visa renewal. If I lose this job, I could lose my status. Please, I have children." "Should have thought about that before you screwed up," James interrupted. "I don't have time for incompetent workers who argue with me. You're done." David stepped forward again, his voice rising with indignation. "This is completely unfair. She didn't do anything wrong. You can't just fire her for following your own specifications." James turned on David with barely contained rage. "You want to join her? Because I can arrange that. In fact, maybe I should. 2 fewer paychecks means 2 fewer problems for me." The threat hung in the air. David looked at Maria, then back at James. He had student loans totaling $87,000. An apartment he could barely afford, and a pregnant girlfriend. His sense of justice warred with his sense of self-preservation. The silence stretched out painfully as he made his decision. I still think this is wrong," David said finally, his voice weak, his eyes not quite meeting Maria's. Maria saw the apology in his averted gaze and felt something inside her break. She wasn't angry at David, she understood survival instincts too well. But the loneliness of that moment, standing on a construction site in a country that wasn't quite home, facing economic ruin and possible deportation because of one man's cruelty, felt overwhelming. "I'll get my things," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears she refused to let fall. As she walked toward the temporary buildings that housed the workers' lockers, James called after her, "And Santos, I'm marking your termination as fired for cause. Good luck explaining that to immigration." Each step Maria took felt heavier than the last. In her locker, She had a lunch her roommate had packed: rice, beans, and a small piece of chicken, the same meal she ate almost every day to save money. Pinned to the inside of the locker door was a drawing Isabella had sent her, a child's colorful crayon rendering of their family holding hands, with "Te amo, mommy," written across the top in uneven letters. Maria had last seen her daughters 2 years ago, when she'd saved enough for a brief visit home. Isabella, now 12, had barely recognized her. Sophia, 10, had cried and clung to her grandmother when Maria tried to hug her. The visit, meant to be a joyful reunion, had instead been a painful reminder of all the moments she'd missed: birthday parties, school plays, first days of school, bedtime stories. Every sacrifice had been for them, for their education, for their health care, for their future. And now, because of a lie about cement bags and a manager's personal problems, it was all crumbling. In the locker room, Maria allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to sit on the bench and let the reality sink in. She had $1,847 in her bank account. Her rent was $650 a month, split with 2 other immigrant workers in a 1-bedroom apartment in a dangerous neighborhood. Without a job, she had maybe 3 months before everything fell apart. 3 months to find new employment as a worker fired for cause. 3 months before she'd have to explain to her daughters why the money stopped coming, why their school fees couldn't be paid, why their grandmother's medical bills would go uncollected. Through the thin walls, she could hear the construction site returning to normal. Tools being picked up, the cement mixer starting, men calling to each other with the easy camaraderie of people who still had jobs. Someone laughed at a joke she couldn't hear. Maria thought about America, the country that had promised opportunity but delivered mostly exhaustion and fear. She thought about the Statue of Liberty she'd seen in a movie once, with its famous inscription about huddled masses yearning to breathe free. She wondered if Emma Lazarus had ever mixed cement, ever felt the panic of an unjust termination, ever stood in a government office for 6 hours only to be told her paperwork was incomplete. She thought about her daughters and imagined the phone call she'd have to make tonight. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the American dream is sometimes just a dream, and that waking up can be brutal? When the 5 minutes were up, Maria stood, squared her shoulders, and began emptying her locker. She folded her work vest carefully, collected her few personal items, and took one last look at Isabella's drawing before unpinning it and slipping it into her pocket. As she walked out of the locker room and headed toward the site exit, she passed James Morrison, who was now barking orders at another worker. He didn't even glance in her direction. To him, she'd already ceased to exist. Just another interchangeable body in an orange vest. Easily replaced, instantly forgotten. But David Chen watched her go. He stood there with a shovel in his hands, cement dust on his boots, and shame in his heart. That night, he would go home to his girlfriend and tell her what happened. He would justify his silence by talking about the baby on the way, about his responsibilities, about being realistic. She would tell him she understood. But both of them would know that something small but significant had died in him that day. Some piece of the person he'd thought he was, the person he'd wanted to be. As for James Morrison, he would continue his downward spiral. The $50,000 payment would come due, and he'd borrow from the company payroll to pay it, starting a chain of financial crimes that would eventually destroy Morrison and Associates Construction entirely. In 6 months, he would be arrested for embezzlement, and the construction site would be abandoned mid-project, a concrete skeleton haunting the Detroit skyline. But Maria didn't know any of that as she walked through the site gates for the last time. All she knew was that she'd been broken by the weight of cement bags she'd carried correctly, fired for following instructions precisely, punished for being powerless. She pulled out her phone and looked at the most recent photo her mother had sent. Isabella and Sophia in their school uniforms, standing in front of their small house, smiling at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of children who still believed their mother was coming home soon. Maria walked to the bus stop, sat down on the bench, and finally let herself cry. The morning sun, which had seemed so promising just an hour ago, now felt merciless and exposing. Around her, Detroit woke up, cars rushing past, people heading to jobs they still had, the city humming with the energy of survival and aspiration. Somewhere in that great American machine, there had to be a place for Maria Santos. There had to be a way forward, another job, another chance. She would find it, she had no choice. Her daughters were depending on her. But right now, on this bus stop bench, with cement dust still clinging to her jeans and Isabella's drawing crumpling in her pocket, Maria allowed herself to acknowledge the brutal truth. Sometimes the American dream felt less like opportunity and more like punishment for daring to hope. The bus arrived, and Maria stood up. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and stepped aboard. The driver, an older black woman with kind eyes, nodded at her sympathetically, as if she knew exactly what kind of morning Maria had endured. "Rough day, honey?" she asked. Maria managed a small smile. "Yeah, rough day. Well, tomorrow's coming whether we're ready or not," the driver said, pulling back into traffic. "Sometimes that's a curse. Sometimes it's a blessing. Either way, we keep going." Maria found a seat by the window and watched the construction site disappear behind her. The driver was right, tomorrow was coming. And Maria Santos, immigrant, mother, construction worker, would face it the same way she'd faced every day since leaving Honduras. With determination born of desperation, with love for her daughters, and with the weary knowledge that in America, survival itself was a full-time job. The bus rolled on through Detroit's streets, carrying Maria toward an uncertain future, past thousands of other people carrying their own burdens, chasing their own dreams, breaking under their own weights. And the city, indifferent and eternal, continued its rhythms, building up, tearing down, building up again, the endless cycle of construction and destruction that cared nothing for the individual stories of hope and heartbreak that made up its living flesh. In her pocket, Isabella's drawing shifted against Maria's leg, a small reminder that somewhere, someone was waiting for her to come home. And for now, on this bus, on this Tuesday, that would have to be enough to keep moving forward.